Good evening, peoples, and welcome again to my living room for our Tuesday evening Bible study with me and Gingersnap. We are in my living room, but also in a frame of royal purple for the occasion. So it is, of course, peak spooky season. So Gingersnap is modeling in front of one of our Halloween pillows, and I've got another Halloween sweater and a classic movie monster minimalist nails and a spiderweb eyeliner. And this is my favorite holiday, okay? There's a lot of stressful things in the world, and this is what I'm taking joy in. So this month, as a loose theme connecting our Bible studies, we are looking at some of the characters whom I have dressed up as for Halloween, because why not? So we looked at Esther and Yael and Salome, and so this week we're going to look again at Lydia, whom I preached on this past Sunday. So Lydia is a character in the book of Acts. She just shows up very briefly, but she's a pretty big deal because she is considered to be the first European convert, which, it's kind of a big deal, first European convert. And she is regarded as the patron saint of dyers and people who work with fabric. So from Acts 16, hear now the word of the Lord. We set sail from Troas and took a straight course to Samothrake, the following day to Neapolis, and from there to Philippi, which is a leading city of the district of Macedonia and a Roman colony. We remained in the city for some days. On the Sabbath day, we went outside the gate by the river, where we supposed there was a place of prayer, and we sat down and spoke to the women who had gathered there. A certain woman named Lydia, a worshipper of God, was listening to us. She was from the city of Thyatira and a dealer in purple cloth. The Lord opened her heart to listen eagerly to what was said by Paul. When she and her household were baptized, she urged us, saying, "If you have judged me to be faithful to the Lord, come and stay in my home." And she prevailed upon us. This is the word of the Lord. So there's a lot that we don't know about the first century house churches, because until the year 313, it's either 313 or 317, but I think it's 313, and at the point, Christianity was illegal in the Roman Empire, until finally there was an emperor who was like, maybe we don't need to persecute and kill them all. They're okay. Actually, it's going to become the formal religion. So for the first couple centuries, we met in homes because we didn't have formal structures, because if it's, fundamentally illegal to practice what you're practicing, it's probably not the best idea to have a formal building. So it was kind of an underground network, and so people met in homes, maybe one or two families gathering together over a meal. And so Christianity was kind of spread by word of mouth and by pen pal relationships. So there is a description of the first churches earlier in Acts, which I really, really like a lot. I'm sure I've read it numerous times before. Once had it done in henna on my back. So in Acts 2:43, after the story of Pentecost, a little bit after, it says, "Awe came upon everyone." Or in Greek, it's a bit more literally, "Awe came upon every soul," which I think is a lovely phrase. Awe came upon every soul, because many wonders and signs were being done by the apostles. All who believed were together and had all things in common. They would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all, as any had need. Day by day, as they spent much time together in the temple, they broke bread at home and ate their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having the good will of all the people. And day by day, the Lord added to their number those who were being saved. This is the word of the Lord. So many of the first converts started out as Jews, and so they would still go to the temple. Paul would often preach in temples, and so would some of the other disciples. So Lydia is one of the first who's coming in who doesn't necessarily come from that background. She's been very quiet this evening. I really should have had the electric blanket turned on in previous weeks when she was climbing all over me. They're cute, but distracting. So when I studied abroad in Rome, gosh, over a decade ago at this point, I got to see the remains of some of the first house churches that over time have kind of been buried as Rome has grown over the centuries. It's literally grown up because of erosion and where the soil goes. So some of the first formal church buildings were deliberately built on top of the first house churches so that they could be in what had been holy spaces of prayer for generations before. And in some places there's a house church, and then there's an early church, and then there's a newer church on top. And so you literally have to go underground to see the layers, and it's really, really cool. So in the course of doing some research to put together this costume, which I made from scratch, as one does, I learned some interesting things about first century clothing and fabrics. So like all first century Greco-Roman clothing is a series of rectangles. Rather than cutting out any kind of shape, it was just rectangles. So rather than sewing things together, you would, I want to say but it would be pretty complicated. You would weave a piece of fabric in the size of rectangle that you wanted, so it would be all finished edges. When I bought my linen blend at Joann's, obviously I was getting it from a bolt of cloth, so I did have to do some hemming. Gosh darn it. But Lydia wouldn't have been hemming. She just would have been having rectangles. So I was doing a lot of layering. So one of my giant rectangles, 2 yards of fabric, so much fabric, with some buttony gap sleeves at the top and a bunch of ribbons for belting. Obviously I didn't grab the ribbons because cat. And then a darker pink rectangle over that with draping and pretty clasps. And on top of all of this is a palla, which is really heavy because this is 12 feet long. 12 feet of fabric, which is very long drapey veil. So it's in part a modesty thing, but more it's a sun cover because there's sun in the Middle East, or kind of a desert. So for sun protection without sunscreen or modern hats, the women would cover themselves with long veils, and so their heads and necks would be covered, and their arms and all of that. So most dyes came from plants because, there's only so much you can do in the first century without, the Industrial Revolution or what. Hey, no, we're hanging out together. So I did some research on the color palettes of the first century, and it is fairly pastel because of the plant dyes that they had. Although there were some darker colors, so a kind of an eggplanty purple like this might have come from lichen and ammonia, and so I found like some recipes. I didn't end up dyeing my own fabric, considered it, decided I'd rather have a life, and found some good colors. But the lengths that people would go to have colorful clothing, which they did. When we think of the Greco-Roman world, we tend to think of things as all white because the statues as we see them now are white. At the time, they were painted really bright colors, but over 2,000 plus years, the paint is chipped away, or it's faded, or it's been rubbed off or eroded or whatever. So what we see are bright white, but that's definitely not what they had at the time, especially when white clothes are kind of hard to maintain, especially in an era when you didn't have washing machines, which are a wonderful feature of the modern world. I often take them for granted, but I can't imagine life without them. It would be so inconvenient. So people might only have one or two outfits because it took so much effort to create the threads and to weave things together, and these things would be expensive unless you had more money. And if you had loads of money, then you might be buying royal purple, which is in the frame around me. Someone made a sample according to an ancient recipe, but it's like a magenta, hot pinky kind of, not what I would think of calling purple. at all. And it kind of changes my perception of Roman empires to think of them wearing this shade rather than what I would think of being purple, which would probably be, oh, it's a pretty light purple, more like this, like that's purple. This is like magenta or something. But as language develops, so every language has words for black and white. And as languages develop more words, they will acquire a word for red. So those are the base words. And then, and people have like done linguistic studies on this, it's so cool. So then after a word for red, they will get a word for either green or yellow. So if there's no word for green, then what we would call green would be called a shade of yellow. Or if there's no word for yellow, then you would call yellow a shade of green. So language develops along those lines. And even the word brown will come before purple. So purple would be called a shade of red, and so would orange, which is so cool. I take a lot of words for granted, apparently, but that's how things develop. Super cool. She's inspecting the air vents. They're a very good place in the winter because they're warm air, which is nice if you're tiny. Please don't bite that. Anyway, so this is what Lydia would have been selling. So she would have been hanging out with a lot of very high, powerful people, which might have been dangerous because if she is dealing with people in authority and government, and she has, joined this religion that's illegal, and she's having people meet in her home. And so it would be on the first floor of the house would be where you did your business. So that's where she would be storing fabric, showing people fabric, etc. And then on the second or third floors, that's where you would be living. And so that's where she'd be having people meeting. So it seems like it might be kind of dangerous to have illegal Christians in your home, as you yourself are an illegal Christian. But the people who are buying this expensive fabric from you might want to persecute or kill you. So Lydia might have been taking some risks by deciding to be baptized and to join this new movement. So she only shows up the one time in the book of Acts. So there's only so much that we know about her. And there's, I desperately wish that if I had access to a time machine, which obviously doesn't exist because that's science fiction, one of the things that I would deeply love to do would be to see what it was like to be in a meeting of one of the first house churches. We are having something, I guess, a little bit thematically similar now as we pray in our homes. Obviously, we're not gathering together in our homes other than, this way. But the idea of meeting in such small units. And so the heart of Christianity becomes conversations over shared meals. Because quite a lot of what Jesus was doing in his ministry while he was alive was eating with people and having conversations with them. And that's where Christianity came from and spread. So it's our relationships with each other, not essentially fan clubs of Jesus, which, not that it's not, but that's not what it is primarily. And it's not, a book club that's been meeting for 2,000 years for a single book, because there's just always more to just discuss about, this one book. But it's about our relationships with each other. And that is the heart of Jesus's message. Love others, love your neighbor, treat people as you would be treated. And so the idea of gathering in these small groups and having these really intimate conversations over dinner after the day's work is done is a really beautiful image. And it can be harder to maintain those intimate relationships when we have larger churches as the centuries go on. I like that our church is kind of small. It makes it much easier to know people's names, and it makes it much easier to find a place to belong rather than being lost in a giant crowd. So that's a bit of rambling on the first century and fashion and clothes. And some of you may know I did my undergrad thesis on historical fashion. So it's kind of a thing that I'm into, not usually in the sense of recreating pretty accurate first century garb, but we all have our hobbies. What can I say? So good night. I hope to see some of you for our Wednesday evening prayer service tomorrow, and of course on Thursday as we meet over Zoom. Since it's very, very close to Halloween, I thought it would be fun if perhaps we dressed up for our Zoom gathering, or brought our favorite Halloween candy or treat or whatever. So this one will definitely be convinced to wear a costume, possibly with some bribes, and seems like it would be fun. So I hope to see some of you later this week, and I wish you all a good night. Want to wave good night? Say bye. Sorry, Gingersnap.